Hi, my name is Iyad Rahwan. I'm at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. I'm the director of the Center for Humans and Machines, which is a new center we're establishing here in Berlin. I'll talk to you today about extreme crowdsourcing. And I'm very interested basically in collective intelligence at its limits. And in particular, I want to talk to you about 5 different projects that I was involved in one way or another over the past 10 years. And I'll provide a very quick overview of them, as well as some of the lessons that we've learned from those experiences. So the story starts in 2009 with balloons. In particular, the DARPA Network Challenge, which some of you may be aware of. This is a challenge that was designed to test the limits of social media at the time, which were very much ill understood at the time. The challenge required people to use any means necessary to find 10 weather balloons that would be tethered at 10 random locations all over the continental United States. A team from MIT, led by Sandy Pentland, found those 10 balloons in less than 9 hours, winning the prize. And they did this by mobilizing people on social media and using a clever incentive scheme which rewarded not only the people who find the balloons, but also people who recruit the people who found the balloons, or the people who recruited those people, and so on. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the analysis of this of data from this challenge, and we learned a bunch of things. One of the most interesting things we learned is the important role of super mobilizers. So these are people who can mobilize a disproportionate number of others, and they help keep the campaign going, even when the reproductive number, so to speak, is less than 1. So this is kind of similar to the idea of super spreaders in viral pandemics, for instance. We also did some subsequent simulation studies in which we tried to understand to what extent was success in the DARPA Network Challenge feasible. And indeed, we find that it is feasible if you could repeat it under different conditions, although there were a small space within the parameter space that actually allows for something like this to happen. Another thing we learned was the role of misinformation. So you can see here the 10 balloons, the actual locations of the balloons in blue. You could see in red all of the information that was submitted to the MIT team. You could see that it's all over the place, including even in Canada, which was not even part of the challenge. And this was perhaps in part mistaken sightings, but also deliberate sabotage. So there were other teams that were submitting false pictures with false geolocation. They were even photoshopping pictures, and even after discovering that each balloon was manned by a different DARPA official wearing this yellow vest, some of the competitive teams were faking those kind of pictures with including the yellow vest itself. So I think dealing with misinformation has been an extremely important thing that we realized very early on as we were interested in collective intelligence. And this is something obviously that has become a very important phenomenon today. The second challenge is called the tag challenge, and it has to do with finding people. So this time you have to find individuals in a given city by 8 p.m. Using just a mugshot. I led a team that used a similar incentive scheme. This is in collaboration with Manuel Cebrian, who was part of the Red Balloon Challenge team. And we found people using, again, social media. And in fact, out of the 5 targets, we found 3 of them by the deadline. And again, we had some sabotage attempts, people sending us viruses, for instance. And And subsequently, we also ran simulations to try to come up with plausible models of the dynamics of the social recruitments that led to success in this kind of challenge. And again, we find that it's pretty much at the limit of what can be achieved, finding people, namely within 12 hours. So this, the first two challenges have to do with search through physical space for objects or individuals. The third project has to do with search through combinatorial space. So this was a challenge organized by DARPA again, which shredded documents using increasingly powerful industrial shredders. They scanned all the pieces and made them available for teams to assemble. Now, Manuel, who had my collaborator from the first two challenges, had moved to UC San Diego at the time, and he assembled a team that built a platform to enable people to, hundreds of people to simultaneously assemble these shredded pieces together. And indeed, it worked. It was the only team that was using crowdsourcing in a serious manner. Other teams were using computer vision techniques. And this is the second puzzle assembled. And one of the things we learned in our subsequent analysis of the data is that a lot of the progress is driven by a very few number of people. So there are basically a small group of, even though there is a big crowd, there is a small group of committed individuals that really do the bulk of the work. And as the puzzles get harder and harder, this inequality in contribution actually increases. But as the story again goes, sabotage was inevitable because the system was open. This is cumulative progress in the puzzle number 4, after which the team never recovered. So this is one challenge that was not won by crowdsourcing. And as you can see here, that the saboteur was even taunting the UC San Diego team by sending them messages about exactly what he did. And I say he because Wired magazine actually wrote a story, an interview with him, and they gave him a pseudonym, Adam, in which they, and in this interview, they tried to get to the bottom of the motivation behind this. So if you're interested in the story, I would point you to the Wired magazine article. Then I want to move to a more recent project, which has to do with whether we can use collective intelligence and crowdsourcing to control a real-time avatar that's moving in a physical world. And this avatar could be simulated by a human, for instance. The project is called Be Me. It was run by Niccolo Pescetelli, who was my postdoc at the time at MIT. And it was in part inspired by a Black Mirror episode in which this character played by John Hamm was advising somebody in real time during a physical date, a romantic date with somebody. So he had a video feed, so he was seeing what the person was seeing. He was giving him advice and suggestions about how to conduct himself in the date. But there was also a crowd of people that were watching the whole ensuing activities and were making suggestions to John Hamm as well. So John Hamm was giving his own advice, but also in some way integrating information from others. So that's kind of the same structure of the Be Me experiment, which had this, a couple of human avatars who were moving around the MIT campus to complete a fictitious task. And there was an operator in the control room that was communicating with the avatar, with the agent, through a video link. The operator was receiving a live feed, but also able to communicate directly. But the operator was also aggregating information from online users that were suggesting actions for the avatar. And we have a paper coming out in IEEE Computer soon, in which we describe the experience as well as the system. And we also describe how fairly simple natural language processing techniques could actually automate to a large extent the function of this operator. So they're able to, we can show that we can reasonably aggregate these kind of free-form discussions from the crowd. If you want to learn a bit more about that too, the less scientific side of the project, you could also watch this documentary that was directed by Niccolo. And finally, I want to talk about a different kind of challenge, which is how do we search through, how do we use collective intelligence to crowdsource ethical trade-offs in a high-dimensional space. So we looked at autonomous cars, and the backdrop is that the introduction of autonomous cars can help eliminate a large proportion of traffic fatalities today, because 90% or more of fatalities are caused by human error, which is in principle avoidable by machines. But despite this enthusiasm, a lot of people are terrified of allowing AI systems to make life and death decisions in dilemma scenarios, no matter how rare those dilemma scenarios are. And the dilemma scenario that has captured the public imagination is inspired by the trolley problem. And it looks like this. The car is about to crash into a group of pedestrians, but it can swerve and kill just one person on the sidewalk. And the question is whether the car should be allowed to do that, or whether the programmers should program this behavior in anticipation of this scenario. And another scenario is that the car would sacrifice its own passenger to save the greater number of people. Now, we could have a long argument about, in a different talk, about whether this is realistic. Obviously, it's an abstraction, but I do believe that it's an abstraction of a more realistic statistical problem that has to do something with allocation of statistical risk on the road. Nevertheless, we initially ran some studies, some kind of traditional psychological studies using subjects from a Mechanical Turk. And we found some interesting things, like people wouldn't buy a self-sacrificing car. However, they want everybody else to do so because they want to live in a world in which the cars will always minimize harm, even if that means sacrificing the passenger. But that was just one dimension. That was saving basically more people versus less people. We were interested in trade-offs involved in this kind of scenario. This is why we built the Moral Machine website, which presents these kinds of dilemmas, multi-dimensional dilemmas, to people and asks them to choose which outcome of two really bad outcomes they prefer or they dislike least. So in this case, we varied not just the number of potential victims, but also various characteristics of them, such as age, whether they were human or dogs. We vary whether an outcome is the result of omission or commission by the car, whether there is a traffic violation by somebody crossing illegally, and so on. And things really add up quickly, because just with this small factorial design, fairly simple cartoonish scenario, you end up with 26 million possible dilemmas, which is really infeasible by conventional psychological experimental methods. The questions look things like this: would the car swerve to kill two pedestrians to save its occupants? And more people would seem to prefer the car to go straight. A lot of people prefer the car to kill an adult, swerve to kill an adult to save a child. They also prefer the car to kill a jaywalker to save a person who's done nothing wrong. When you start adding, combining things or creating trade-offs between different values, for example, killing two people who are crossing illegally to save one person crossing legally, then things get a little bit more difficult. So thanks to some traditional media, but also some more modern YouTubers who have been playing the game and recording themselves, we managed to amass 40 million decisions from 4 million people worldwide. And we got fairly broad coverage of the entire planet as a result. We also translated the website to all the major languages, many of the major languages. And this helped us quantify the relative importance of different factors that people consider should be taken into account. And there's a whole, we can have a whole discussion about these. But what I want to focus on here is that because we were able to collect such a large amount of data, we were able to conduct an analysis at the level of countries, individual countries, and compare those countries. So you could look at the global average, the global effect sizes of these different factors, and then you can compare specific countries to them or pairs of countries. So you can see here, for example, that Germany and China look very different in terms of certain factors. And we're able to also cluster countries based on the similarities and differences between their ethical preferences. And this, surprisingly, this clustering actually mirrors a lot of well-known anthropological theories. And even quantifying like the differences between the clusters shows some really interesting patterns. So let me close by talking about some lessons from all of these attempts at extreme crowdsourcing. I would say the first one is that the crowds can do a lot in the real world, not just online, in the virtual world. Also, gaming the system is really inevitable. It's something that we've seen in many, many cases. And it's kind of almost a function of this openness of the system. It's important to harness cooperative instincts and incentives, but also curiosity in people's just desire to learn something about themselves, for example, about their own ethical values. It's important to cater for active participants who make disproportionate contribution. We also learned that complex real-time coordination maybe is feasible, but may even be automatable as well. And finally, the moral machine experiment has taught us that high-dimensional long-term experimentation is feasible if you could gamify something, an experiment like this. So if you're interested in more details about any of those projects, here's a list of papers. And I would like to thank you again for listening, and be happy to take questions later on.